Joining. I'm Yashin Abed. I'm your host for this afternoon's workshop that continues from the previous workshop. So welcome and thanks for joining me. And I'll just go over very quickly what we did on Monday. And hopefully most of you were there or actually attended the session and are on the same path that we're on, but I will go through this for the first maybe 10, 15 minutes. Okay, so what I'll start off with is, I'm not going to reintroduce myself. I'll look at comments if people are looking for an introduction again, but I'm going to share my screen. And in my screen, I'm going to just start off with what we did. So we looked at, in essence, just to recover what we looked at, is to say, fundamentally, when we are designing an application that can either be used by a laptop, desktop, a MacBook, a tablet, or a phone itself, we're basically saying that you can either publish an app through the app stores like iOS, that's basically Apple's App Store, or the Android App Store. And using either of those, you can either download it to your device, or you can actually, instead of downloading it or publishing it on those platforms, you can actually create what's called a web application, which means that through your browser app on either of those devices, you can then access the application itself. So that was the purpose of this entire workshop, or the series of workshops that we're doing. We also discussed, in essence, fundamentally, there's a front office and back office. Front office primarily looks at the design, look and feel of the application itself, but all the heavy lifting and databasing and scripting actually happens on the server side or the back end. And for some cases, when you look at things like your mobile browsers or your browsers anywhere that they exist, they are JavaScript enabled, and you can actually do some of the what's called backend coding directly on the device itself. But it's obviously it's better to put that code on the backend because people can disable Java-side scripting, or JavaScript, and that means your application won't work as well. So in essence, we said that we are looking at 2 or 3 main languages that we're going to be covering, or 4 actually, when you think about it. The first language is HTML, which just basically has everything that we're going to be writing about. The second thing that we're talking about is actually the CSS, which how we're going to style it, make it look and feel. The third thing we talked about which is scripting. We said we'll start off with JavaScript on the actual device, because a lot of you might not have access to a server-side scripting platform and you just want to do things to try it out, and you can do it directly on your machine. And the fourth thing is a database platform, which is SQL is the general language, SQL, and we would then actually look at database scripting. But for the purposes of today, we're just going to complete and close the loop around. What we went through is we designed a page, what it should look like. And that design would look like the PowerPoint item. Let me just, that would be, sorry, I'm just getting to that, the web app itself. So this is in essence what we designed the app to look like, fundamentally from look and feel. And once we designed that, we said, okay, fundamentally, if that's how it looks like, we've got to create each HTML page. In this case, we created one, which was the index HTML. That's the first thing that we have to create, because when you create it from your root folder and you click on that, everything happens from the index.html. Then we had to style each of those using CSS. And actually, after that, we did another thing, which was we created, oops, let me just do this, created some base code for the button to work, right? Then we need to check if it's responsive. So today we're going to check if the button worked, check if it's responsive, and how do we publish this to go live, and see what all of that actually entails. Okay, so I see some people do want a bit of introduction of myself. So very quickly, I have been in the IT industry for over 20 years. My studying background is basically, I did a BCom in informatics. I then did a BSc honors in digital technology. That was with the Dublin, University of Dublin, or University of Technology in Dublin. The third item was I did an INSEAD master's degree in master's in MBA, executive MBA. And that primarily I looked at, other than the content, I focused around digital technology or digital transformation and leapfrogging digital transformation, especially in third world or emerging economies. I've been about 18 years with Standard Bank as an executive. I've been with MTN. I finally decided to open up my own company. It's called DigiSite. And basically it looks at the insights, hindsights, foresights, and oversight that you need when actually looking at digital transformation as an entire journey. And in that regard, that's basically encompasses everything around this. And I've also introduced the coverage around what we're trying to achieve here. So now, if we go back to the code, let me share that. Okay, so we talked about Visual Studio Code. The reason why I said, look, it's a good platform for me, it's because it's free, firstly, so everyone can download it. Secondly, it's basically, it shows you errors, highlights a few errors, creates structure, completes your text for you. So it's very, very useful to use when you're actually typing up HTML, CSS3, Java, and the like. So I would always say, look, create that, use that, and it's really helpful. So the first thing, we created a folder, then we created this content. Again, in the comment section, please indicate to me if you want me to go through what each of these tabs generally mean. I'm just going to go through it from a high level. So we basically created the form content, and we created what's under the script. That would be the JavaScript that we're running for this function when we click the button. Okay, so I don't see the CSS. Let me just, okay, there's our CSS as well. Okay, and here we basically styled each of the elements that we created on the main form. So this being the form, we then basically created all the elements that were identified in this content, right? And that's how the form actually came into being. Now, I just want to make sure that everyone can see. Okay, so what we've done is we've created on HTML and inputs, we created a form. Form said we have two labels, first name, last name, and a button that says say my name. And when you click on it, on the click event, you go to a function, which is our JavaScript, saying say my name. Here we basically just choosing a variable, assigning it to the actual value, which is your first name, F name, plus a space, plus your last name, ending with a semicolon as JavaScript will require. The next thing is we're looking at the actually finally the output, which will be hi, your name is, and your name and surname will actually come up. And that was the idea. It's very rudimentary, like I said. And the idea is just to actually make you saying that when we're designing the front end, there's no functionality. You can create a button, click it, it won't do anything. You've got to actually tell it what to do. And that is where your server-side languages come in, or your scripting languages. And this is where people use PHP, or they'll use JavaScript or Java or Python. You can use almost any specific language. It just depends what engine you have running on your server side. Typically on your local machine itself, you can use JavaScript itself, because that's, I think, that's the latest language that people are using on their service, desktops. If you're trying to create script language that's not running on a web server, then use JavaScript, and you do it either like this, or you create a .js file. How do we create a .js file? We basically, sorry, let me just extend that. Let's just open the folder on my desktop where the web app is. Okay, so now all you do is in the folder where you've got all of your content, you would just then create a file, and we'll just call it test. don't do this in caps lock, test.js. And in essence, what happens is you can already see this identifies this as a JavaScript file. And when you're using this code, for example, you don't have to write it in the document. You can actually create a link to the file. And here you do exactly the same as you did this. And you would just use link, blah, 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 creating a link to the JavaScript file. But in this case, we've actually embedded the JavaScript in the HTML side. It will identify that this is script, JavaScript, and will run accordingly. So let's get back to the actual application. Okay, I'm just going to share and get to the application itself. Okay, now this is the application. We basically created a bit of the name around the application. We've created a header here, first name, last name. Now you can see immediately when you're looking at the size, even such a big screen, first name looks very, very small. Last name looks very, very small. So let's get back to the application. And this is where we can see what it looks like. Let's get back to the code and let's restyle this, all right? When we go back to the code itself, we look at, okay, the first thing was on the labels. We made the font size 2 vmin. That seems a bit small. So let's make it 2 vmax. So that says, okay, the maximum 2 is the percentage of the total screen size, right? So 100 would be 100%. So if it was vmin says if horizontal and vertical. So the minimum size between the two. If I've got a bigger horizontal, then my minimum will be the vertical, and it will say, okay, from that basis, create a version. So I'm always looking at, the reason I'm using vmin and vmax is because I'm always looking at the device, because the device can change. It won't be a static laptop, desktop with a 15-inch, 13-inch, 14-inch screen. The screen sizes will differ. So I'm saying the viewer portal will actually determine this. And on that, I created vmax. So let's say this. Let's get back to the page. And here we can see first name, last name is a bit small. Let's refresh that. And that looks a bit bigger and looks a bit better. And the output content also looks a bit small. So let's look at that. Let's go there. Let's go to the code again. And we know that is basically an input button that says say my name. And we haven't indicated the size. So let's actually give it a font size as well of 2. Same as the other one. Font size of 2 vmax, save this. Then we go back to the actual application. Let's go back there. Let's refresh it again, because every time we're publishing, the index is changing, but the page will store what's in the cache. So we're refreshing it, just refreshing the cache itself. And here we said, okay, great. First name, last name. We said that when it actually comes or hovers over the input fields, it must be changing to a pointer. And here we said when we hover over the button, say my name must actually become highlighted as red or tomato. Okay, so now just to test it quickly, we'll put in my name, Yashin, surname, Abed, and say my name. Hi, your name is Yashin Abed. Okay, great. So this works. And for that purpose, we know that the application itself can work. Now, remember, this is rudimentary. You've got to think about everything. You design your screens themselves. I'm going to go to this content here again. Okay, so now we're saying design each page, create HTML pages, style each HTML page. And this requires you to have that basic knowledge around HTML, CSS, JavaScript, and or PHP, depending on what you're using in the back end, or Node.js or AngularJS, whatever sort of languages you're using. And the reason for this is you could use something like WordPress, Java, Joomla, or Wix. And what those are is they say, look, we've got templates, we've got a visual front end. You can drag and drop blocks and bases, and you can actually have all of that there. Sorry, which app should I download? And for actually typing up the code. Visual Studio Code is the app that you need to download. Okay, so what I was saying is that you could actually create all of this using one of those compilers. And I think Wix, for example, I think is free. I think WordPress is also free. And it just depends on which templates you are using, what items you're trying to do. But let's assume that many of you are actually trying to become coders or software programmers, or actually going into more deep programming. A lot of those templates will actually only take you thus far or so far. And you would then need to enhance or change it. And to do that, you would need to understand, firstly, the code that you're using. And secondly, where to change it and how to change it. So that's why, regardless of your process, whether you're going to use things like WordPress in the future, because they're much easier to create the front end, but that logic processing you still need to do. You'd still, I think, need to understand the basics of HTML, CSS, and PHP, especially when you're trying to fine tune everything. Okay. Now, we know that we've created a bit of an application for now. Is that good enough? Actually, no. Because we need to look at this application and understand, firstly, is it responsive? And we do this by right-clicking on the web page and clicking Inspect. So I click on Inspect, and this allows me to say, okay, what happens when I resize my page? So this will say, okay, what are my different devices? What is it going to look like if I have different devices, right? And as you can see, it's resizing, meaning it's responsive to the size of the screen that it will see. And we generally are happy with that. However, that's not actually telling us everything, because we actually want to see, well, I want to know the look and feel of this item when I actually open it via either an app, via tablet or phone. And you'll see at the top end of this item will be a device, toggle device toolbar. It looks like a tablet and a phone. And let's click on that. And you'll see there, this is basically saying, if you've got an iPhone X, if you're following my little pointer, this is what it will look like when you open up your iPhone X on this link. When you open up my website, iPhone X, this is what the app looks like. And I can say, look, I'm happy with this because this gives me additional content that I may want to put in below. And for now, it's good enough for me to actually look like this. And let's say, okay, I'm actually interested in an iPad. Okay, this looks, I can see it. It looks good enough for me. I look at an iPad Pro. Okay, that's also bigger. It's better. I can go into a Samsung Galaxy S5. And this is where it's really, really beneficial. So this is where it's called responsive. I actually then can say, you know what, let's move things around. Let's do what we want to do with it, change the height and size. And this basically allows us to do many, many different things around this. So please, very important to you all is actually, you need to remember that when you're doing website or web app development, this is your biggest important tool, because this allows me to do a few things. When I actually go into this, this shows me my HTML code, right? And when I click on this, this tells me what's happening with each item. So I can go here, it highlights it, and you can see what's happening is. Then when you go here to the bottom, under the actual styles tab, you will see everything relating to how we styled and what applies. So for example, let's say I don't like this font size. I can change this to, I say, okay, look, I want it to be 1.5. Whoops, 1.5. And it will change it as we're working on it. So this is in essence a way for you to finalize or fine tune or actually tidy up, clean up the edges, just so that you to actually change things to become much better in the way that they look. Now, like I said as well, this is not changing the actual code. This gives you an example for you to make that you think, okay, 1.5 is good enough, and then I'll go to the code and change it there. Or you'll go back and say, look, okay, I was happy with 2. I can change other things. I want to change my font color. I want to change my font weight, which is the boldness. This allows me to actually just change it while we work on it. This looks at, like I told you, the HTML. So this is the CSS associated to the HTML. And it just depends on where you click, will it show you what's happening. Finally, you click on console. The console tab here. So remember, we right-clicked and we said inspect what's happening. And this allows you to also look at whether there are issues around your code. So on my JavaScript, if I had any issues, if I was doing something wrong, referencing files that didn't exist, anything, it would come up here under my source code itself. And this also tells me what sources I'm accessing. It's all information and shows me my code itself, all the code that I'm utilizing, whether it is the main or index, everything that we're looking at from that perspective. So like I said, you don't have to, once you've published your web page, or everything that's happening, everything that your web page is doing is actually read by these items. And things like Google Chrome, that's why I really like Google Chrome as my browser, you can do that. The other thing you can do is, let's say you really like a web page, you can just view the page source, and that will give you all the code that's happening around this item. And that's great. That's just the HTML source, by the way. Okay. And you can the styling you can also see when you're actually going to inspect. Now that tells us what we've learned thus far is we've learned how to now look at whether our website is or page is responsive. We've also looked at how we are moving things around, how to inspect it, how to actually, test things, redesign it, change things on the fly as it exists. You can go to any page and do this. You can go, if you like Standard Bank, for example, you go to standardbank.co.za and you can start changing things on the web page. But like I said, this gives you access to the code that's in the page, but it doesn't give you access to change the code. So you still won't be, whatever you do will be temporary and will be loaded for that purpose of that page. Okay. That is great for now. We are well into this. Now, we're going to look at publishing. So in essence, so now we've got these bits of code. We've created the most important bits, which is our index.html file, which our web servers will pick up to actually read as the hosting file. Then we've said, okay, how do we style it? We've created a main.css file, and the main.css file, we've basically told the HTML file here where to access this. And we've also then created the content of the script. We haven't created a separate file. And we've also, in essence, created a logo. The logo basically is existing on that same root directory. Okay, so now when we go back there, we will see that I created a web app directory. And we've got the index.html has to be that. The logo that we're going to be using, because we've told it to use this logo file, but this is the main root directory and a web app, and main.css because that's the file we've named. Okay, great. So let's get to publishing this actually, and this is really going to go live. And I am looking for Google. Okay, so now you might have heard of cPanel. So cPanel, if you actually basically buy web hosting, and in this case, my website is hosted by Afrios, and they give you access to a tool to manage your web server and items in that, so your databases, your email, and more importantly, your website content. So you go there. In this case, I got, for the first year, you get a website domain for free, but you got to pay website hosting, which costs about 49 or 39 Rand a month for the base packages. And then you get more complex packages as you produce. Then you go to a thing called File Manager. Under File Manager, you will see public HTML. This is the most important page for you. And this is when you call your site. So in this case, my website is called digisite.co.za. Let me just put it in under the chat. So when you actually go into my website, you will access everything under index.html and the associated domains and information therein. Okay, but in this case, we're going to create a new folder because we're not going to edit my domain, and we're going to call it, let's call it Say My Name. Say My Name. Okay, create the new folder. Okay, so now we go to Say My Name in the subfolder. As you can see, the directory is up, it's empty. We'll upload. Now, normally, cPanel is funny this way, is that it wants you to only upload one file, or we can do one file at a time. Since we only have 3, let's just use a drop file concept. I'm just going to drop those 3 files. Okay. Just getting there quickly. We're there. Okay, so the 3 files, we don't need the test.javascript because we've got nothing in it. So I've dropped those 3 files. They all exist. Okay, and that's great. Now that means, okay, let me move this. Everything's great. If you go to the bottom, it says go back to your home. And now we try to see if everything works. Okay, so let's go back to another .digisite.co.za/ and we call it Say My Name. Say My Name. Oof, there's a problem because I've forgotten. Oh, Say My Name. What did I call it? Capital S. Okay, there we go. So as you can see, it's also case sensitive in that regard, but now this is live. So if you go to, let me just put this in the chat box as well. This is live. I'll leave it there for a while, like a day or 2. And in essence, if any of you want to access it, you can access it and you can play around with it as it looks at from the content, from the inspection, the code and the like, and can ask questions if you're attending tomorrow's session. So anything around that. So for the purposes of actually publishing, you can realize that it's very, very easy to publish a website. Obviously, you can see there's an S around that. I'm not here to teach you around website hosting and the like, but that means I've got an SSL certificate, which means it's secured. And anyone that wants a website, especially if you've got customers attending, you want Google, you want the proper Google sort of ranking. And I have not ranked mine yet or put on search engine optimization. But when you want to do that, you need at least a secured item. You got to do the meta tags. You got to do a whole lot of things around your website itself. Okay, so I am stopping with the content around what we're doing there. The next item I actually want you to actually decide on is we need to now do a bit of database integration. Now we can't actually, we can use this same app. You can basically say, in essence, Say My Name is a capability. And in this case, you can see we have nothing. So let me just refresh this. But we could also put a submit tab there. And if we put a submit, we could then say, okay, we want to publish this to a database. And, or we can actually create something completely different where we look at a few things. So I'm going to leave it up to you guys right now for the flow of events, because I want this to be interactive and I want to be teaching content that's relevant. So now I'm going to go here. We've gone live, we've covered all the content here, and I'm saying, okay, fundamentally, we need to do database. Oops, cancel this. Database. So we've got to create a database. So this is in the back end. This means create, read, write, update, right? We don't need to do all. We could just do some of that. We could potentially create a login page. We could potentially just create a form submit page. And yeah, so fundamentally, the idea is we want to do things now at the back end, which probably means server-side scripting. Or we could do it on the front end, which is very risky, and I'll tell you why. So generally, if we create database access protocols with the front end or on our browsers, we're going to be putting things like the login IDs, passwords. You're going to see how you're writing to the database. And you don't want any user that just accesses your pages to see how you access the database. So generally, when you talk about security, you need to know your username and password, that you're accessing the database from your application is secured. And therefore, it is always best to be writing that in the backend at the server itself, where they don't have access to that code. And then also basically submitting a few other things from that. So we want to do, any submission on the database, we'll create the database tables and we'll submit to those database tables. Another way we can do this is actually, setting up either a login page or a form submit. I will leave it up to you guys to say, okay, what is it that you want to do for the next session? Because we're going to get homework going forward. In essence, that I want you all to say that, look, if you're going to download Visual Studio Code, you're going to create a website, or not a website, but a web app. And in this web app, you're basically we're all going to create something that is shared and agreed upon by this group. And we're going to say, okay, fundamentally, that's what we're going to do. Then we can do this. I will, Tabiso, any people that contact Tabiso that are interested in actually getting their work vetted by me to say, look, asking me questions, are they on the right path? I will help you and guide you along. And we will then, in tomorrow's session, go through the actual code where we will actually say, okay, here's an example of the form that we created. Here's the HTML code. Here's the CSS code. Here's the JavaScript code. And if we're doing backend processing, as you can see on my specific website share, and this is why it's important for you to note this. Let me just go here. When you look at the cPanel, when you get hosted by most generic web host companies, the most common way they host you is with PHP MyAdmin. That means your underlying code that you have, the engine that you're going to have to write the code is with PHP. Now, PHP is fine. 80%, I think, of the world's databases, websites, use PHP. So it's still a relevant language. But most of the stuff that you want to do is probably on languages that are more relevant for your programming background. And obviously, my preference is always JavaScript, or Java or JavaScript. You could use Python. You could use other languages as well. But those languages also have a specific reason when you use them. And when you're looking at, for example, a web app development, my preference is always something like Java or JavaScript, because it's your quantity of people that know the language, the availability of your domain around, your ability to be employed is much bigger. It's global. But I still think, like, if you're looking at web app development, you should have PHP, you should have JavaScript, you should have Java. Those all kind of like, speak to each other. And then obviously you should have Python as well. So don't limit yourself on your backend languages. You should have at least those 4, I would say. And then from a database perspective, know either MySQL, Mongo databases. You can look at Microsoft SQL, but generally they work very, very similar. The nuances are very, very small. So, you just need to know, okay, if I'm using a Microsoft, I got to do this. If I'm using my PL SQL or MySQL, I got to do this. Yeah, so those little items you actually learn as you go along, but it really doesn't matter. You just need to know which ones. MySQL is free. Microsoft SQL is very, very expensive. Those are some of the examples that pros and cons that you need to be aware of. Now, that being said, I'm just looking at the chat room, and I don't see any options around the app development itself. So, I'll suggest that we actually create a form. So on the chat items, just tell me, what would you like to see in the form? So in essence, I'm thinking we'll put in content and have a submit button, right? So if I'm going to share the PowerPoint item, and let's look at function, right? So here we can say, in essence, I'm going to have a form, and form is going to have a submit button. When I submit, check if record exists. And if exists, say something to user, else save in database, right? Okay, so that's what we're going to do. Let me just make this smaller. Okay, so now in essence we started with a process which says design it. Reason why we started with the design first is because if you design it, all the intricacies, everything where things should fit, toggle, look, in essence, we basically start making things look much prettier. So let's create, and I'll be constantly looking at things in the chat box. If you've got something specific to tell me that we should add or shouldn't add or remove. So here we're starting with this item here itself. Now, we are thinking, okay, we need to minimize space or maximum because it's a web app. It's a web app, we're trying to access it from any item. So we're going to create a menu box. Let's just call it a menu box so that allows you to do a few things. All right, let's just make this, let's clear this. I don't want actually anything there. So here I'll say, okay, edit text menu, right? Now, the reason why I'm just calling it a menu box is because there's a way of creating a menu item itself. And nowadays we hover over it or we click on it and it'll actually drop down. So we'll only allow it to drop down with what's on the menu when we click on it, because why? You can't use hover on an iPhone or Samsung or most of the smartphones, but you can use it on your mouse-enabled devices. So we actually need to be catering for both. Now we're saying, okay, great, we've got a menu. Here we're going to put a bit of a, let's put another thing here. Again, remember, a nice logo. Oops. Logo. And let's just say, okay, great. Whoops. Another shape here. Let's put, okay, here we're going to say the app name. Let's call it, I'm just going to call it app name. You guys can reference, let's call it COVID app. COVID app, okay. And here we're basically going to have a text box. Okay, let's do this. Let's insert text box here. Let's basically create. Let's just say, okay, my text will be your name. Okay, now obviously this will be too big. So let's make this the right size. About that, that's fine. So we're saying, okay, name, and there'll be a little box where people will actually be allowed to put in their name. Okay, let's make this so, okay. Okay. Now, you must be thinking, imagine writing code for this each time. And this is where things like compilers like Wikipedia, I'm sorry, WordPress, and the like actually are beneficial, because as you draw this, it basically puts in the underlying code. But like I said, we are not trying to use those methods right now. And we're going to say, okay, let's just say name, surname, give you a bit of an ID number. Date of birth. And I think that's enough. I can't think of anything else. And let's see COVID status. COVID status. Okay, and submit, right? So in essence, basically, this app is created for these government workers that are going to go around, and I'm making this up. So we basically creating this app. Government workers are going to go around. They're going to go to each house and capture the individuals, name, surname, ID, and understand if they've had COVID or not, and just that's it. So we'll create a few statuses around it, but in essence, we're going to create a menu item, logo, COVID app, and all of this itself, right? So that gives us, we need a submit button. Where is it? Button. Let's look at this. Insert shapes. It's just looking like a bevel. Okay. And let's make this submit. Okay, great. Now we have a bit of an app. Now, this means that going to tomorrow at 4 o'clock, most of you would have tried some of this to create this, looking very similar to this, on what it can look like. The logic we want, let's create a new slide. Let's create it as blank is fine. Okay, so on this event itself, we are, what is it that we're going to do? So someone's posted something. Okay. Thanks, Natasha. Hopefully people do benefit from this. So now we're basically going to create this app. We're going to say, what must it do when you click or hover? So this is the functionality now. Hover on menu, submenu drops down for selection, right? Submenu is going to have what? It's going to have, let's say, an about us. It's going to have contact info, and basically, so in essence, there's going to be a web page. This is going to be another web page. And when you click on these items, it will open or take us to those web pages. From sub-menu items, you must have the ability to return to main menu. Okay. So now we're looking at functionality of the app. So we said, okay, logo is just for show. COVID app is just the app name for show. The menu is functional. So let's actually change its color. So we know that when we create something that creates a functional aspect, we'll say, okay, it's got to be green. Okay, submit, green. Okay, so now we're saying if I click on the menu, it's going to show me, as we said, about us in context. So as a sub-menu item, and it's going to allow me to then click on it and I'd go to a web page. Remember, you could just have a return. You don't even have to have content in that. All we're doing is we're saying, okay, can I open up another web page? Can I create the code to open up another web page? Can I go back to this new web page? And this, remember, each representation or picture of the app you're talking about is in essence a web page, right? And this is why we're using the Lingo web page. So now we're going to say, okay, now I can go to different aspects around it. Then the third aspect is when I click submit. Number one, check if data is entered. Cannot be blank, right? We want to make sure that we don't need blank or junk garbage data. So we need to do a bit of a check there. Number two, okay, open or insert, check before check if ID number exists, right, in database. Number 3, if exists, message user already entered into database. Let's just say that doesn't sound very nice. Must have something nice. So this ID, whoops, this ID, come on, ID is already entered into the database. Okay, we've got a bit of a message, and if does not exist, create entry into database. Okay, now for those that have the capability to actually create a database, we're basically going to create a database structure that's going to be quite simple, right? So let's just choose, I'm going to delete this actually, and I'm going to insert a table. Insert table, 2 columns by 5. That's 5 for now. Okay, so we have number 1, field name. We should actually have more. Insert. Why doesn't it insert columns to the right? Okay, so I've got a field name, bit of a description, and a field type. So this is where we're storing our data in a database. Our field name first is going to be, let's call it COVID ID. So let's call this table itself. Insert word out. Let's call this table. Remember, this is very, very simple as well. So I'm not trying to complicate things with relational databases, or object databases, or third level normalization. So don't worry about that. This is just the description, just a unique record ID, right? Field type, let's make this integer. Okay, record ID. Okay, next one we want first name, we want last name, we want ID, we want date of birth, we want, and status, COVID status. We should have two fields now, status ID. Okay, and I'll tell you why. First name is basically, we know what first name is, last name, ID, date of birth. COVID status ID, link to predetermined COVID statuses, right? Okay, or field type, or actually, I don't want to complicate things for you guys, a string. So let's just make it COVID status of the individual. Field type, this will be string. Date of birth, we know what that is. I don't need to type it. It's a date field. You get them, sometimes they call them date time fields. This will be in South Africa, we know the ID is actually just numeric. Let's make it integer. Your last name will be string. First name will be string. Because it could be long, let's make it 255. Length, let's make it 255. Well, let's make all our strings 255. Okay. Now, for those that actually want to go through the whole thing, we're going to say, great, you've got a structure, a design of what the app would look like. We're saying, okay, here's the functionality it must have. And here's the database structure that we're going to create. So whether you create it, whether I create it, we're all going to use the same sort of layout. It just depends what code is going to exist under each of these and how we're going to proceed. Okay, now let me do this. Let me save this as on my desktop. I'm going to save it as a presentation and just call it my app. Okay, and I'm going to see how I can utilize this to share content. Looks like it wants me to put it maybe on Google Drive or something. I don't know. Tabiso, if you're online, can I share the file with you? I don't know how to share this file for everyone else. Okay. Thus far, is everyone happy with that? If you can just give me in your chat box a thumbs up or the like. Okay, we've basically got 8 minutes left. Let me do this. What I'm going to do is I'm going to go to my Google Drive. Very quickly, Google Drive. Let's just create a new folder. Let's call it my app 8, and I will then go into my app. Oof. Okay, sorry, I'm just trying to create this, but I'm just trying to think though, Natasha or Tabiso or someone, I'm just trying to think, even if I create it on Google, let me just create it very quickly though. Anyway. Excuse me while I do this. Under documents, okay. I've uploaded it. I will share the link right now. Excuse me. Let's just. Okay, I am publishing it now on the chat for everyone to use. Okay, so it's basically everyone who has access to this link now has the PowerPoint item folder that we just talked around a few things. Tomorrow, we will go through all of this. We will be using a MySQL database. We will be using, we can probably using PHP MyAdmin. And we'll be using HTML, CSS, and a bit of JavaScript and publish it on that. We'll decide whether or not we need PHP MyAdmin, because I can show you how to write a post statement directly from your form and your function on the VB script side, as well as on actually PHP MyAdmin. And that might be a bit too much for you, for us to go through, sorry, not PHP MyAdmin, on a PHP file. So, I don't know, from a chat perspective, I'll ask you guys, do you want me to do it via PHP or VB script or both? And everyone who's attending can also confirm if they've got access to the file and have downloaded the file. Just got 4 minutes left. Yeah. Awesome, great. So you have access to the file. We've gone through everything else. And what we're going to do is now we all have a bit of a design. Let me just actually just do a quick summary. We have covered everything we're meant to cover today. So let's go there. And when we look at, go back, okay. So what we're meant to cover today is we wanted to design each page. We've done that according to the previous item. Created the HTML pages, we styled them. We created base code for the button work, which is in JavaScript. We checked how the files or how the web application is responsive, either to different screen sizes of a desktop, laptops, but also more importantly for tablets and phones itself. So now in essence, you can see why you can design an entire application on a website or web application, and it will look exactly the same as it would be on a phone itself, as a phone app. So you could do that way. Obviously, the disadvantage is to access the app, you need internet capabilities, whereas if you have some apps, when you can download from a store, you can work offline. There are other advantages and disadvantages, but let's just look at that as the main one. And then we've showed how to actually publish this and go live onto an actual web page itself. And what we'll do is we'll do the same thing around the other application we'll create. We've created then, for tomorrow and Friday, we've created a look and feel of an app that we want to actually develop. And we're going to develop this web app. It's got some functionality. We can see that it could add value if we created it. And now this is where our imagination comes in. And looking at this, we can actually then create the app. We've created the functionality of the app, and we've created the database what it should look like at the back end. So we know what, in essence, we're going to create, and we're good to go for tomorrow. So thank you, everyone. I hope you found this session informative and good to have. It's very important. I'm going to actually share one last thing with you guys. Please remember this website, w3schools.com. This is critical. The tutorials under this website are awesome. This is where you get access to artificial intelligence, machine learning. You want to learn about HTML, everything. You want to learn about CSS3. You want to learn about JavaScript. You want to learn about PHP. You're going to get access to all of this content looking at that link, and it's free and it's completely comprehensive. There are tutorials embedded in that. It also allows you to do a lot. But like I said, every time you want to do something, just go into Google and saying, if you're getting confused, first try it out on your own. And then if you're getting stuck, just on Google, how do I do this? And you'll get like GitHub, you get stack.com, you get many, many sites that actually have advice on how to actually do this. And this is how you take your road to mastery, is through trial and error, and how you're leveraging people, networks that have already been through all of this. And again, you'll find that in many cases, especially with code, especially with internet code, a lot of it is free. So you can get an entire, for example, a login structure code on YouTube, on GitHub, on anything, and someone's done the entire thing end to end. And you can just download it, put it on, and if you know your HTML, CSS3, Java or PHP or whatever they're using, jQuery as well, SQL, you can then say, okay, lovely, I can actually modify this and change it to exactly how I want it to look. Okay, thank you everyone, and thank you for listening to me, and hopefully you had a great time. Cheers, bye.